The rusted pickup truck was still playing country music when Elijah Cooper and Haley Mitchell vanished from Highway 61 on that stormy April night in Greenwood, Mississippi. The relentless rain pounded the delta, but a deeper chill ran down the spine of anyone who knew those two young souls would never come home again. At 11:45 p.m., the final message from Elijah's phone appeared, barely legible through water damage. "Someone watching us. Black sedan." A battered leather wallet mentioned in police reports later disappeared, as if erased from existence. In the 20 years that followed, strange fragments of evidence, a waterlogged journal, an old cassette tape, a hidden photograph, emerged one by one from the darkness. And it was this trail of clues that sparked a painful, haunting quest for justice that held Greenwood in its grip for over 2 decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. On April 19th, 1998, Greenwood, Mississippi was drowning under spring storms and the jubilant sounds of the annual Delta Blues Festival. Thunder rumbled above as guitars wailed below, colored lights cutting through the rain-soaked darkness. Among the crowd stood Elijah Cooper, a 22-year-old aspiring musician with calloused fingertips and dreams bigger than the Mississippi itself. His prized possession, an old cassette recorder, captured fragments of music that night, preserved like amber memories. Beside him was Haley Mitchell, 19, a college freshman with a camera always hanging from her neck, her laugh rising above the music whenever Elijah whispered something in her ear. Her faded denim jacket had collected patches from every concert they'd attended together, a wearable scrapbook of their young romance. At 11:15 p.m., the couple left the festival grounds. Friends recalled seeing Elijah's beat-up blue Ford pickup disappearing into the rain, wipers fighting against the downpour as Haley waved one last time through the passenger window. That wave would become the final image their friends carried of them. By midnight, the pickup reappeared in a chilling scene, abandoned on the shoulder of Highway 61, nicknamed the Blues Highway by locals. The driver's door stood open, inviting the storm inside. The radio still hummed with static between songs. The passenger seat held a dark stain that would later confirm everyone's worst fears. The truck's front headlight was shattered, glass scattered across the wet asphalt like diamonds. Inside the vehicle, investigators found a road atlas with a circled location, the old Tallahatchie Bridge, and a woman's rain boot overturned in the mud below the driver's side. No one saw Elijah or Haley after that moment, and the Mississippi night seemed to have consumed them completely. But half an hour after they left the festival, at 11:45 p.m., Elijah's phone briefly connected to a tower. A message sent to his brother read, "Someone watching us. Black sedan." That text lingered in digital space, never delivered until systems reconnected hours later. By then, it was far too late. When police traced the signal, they received coordinates 15 miles from the actual location, sending search teams racing to the wrong area while the true scene grew cold under relentless rain. The Mitchell family reported them missing that night itself. They knew something was wrong when Haley missed her midnight call home, a sacred tradition she never broke. The Greenwood Police Department responded with visible disinterest. "Kids go missing after festivals all the time," one officer said with a dismissive wave. "They probably drove to New Orleans for the weekend. Give it time." When news of the abandoned pickup reached the families the next morning, the police station erupted in chaos. Elijah's father, a Vietnam veteran with a steel gaze, slammed both palms on the reception desk, his voice cutting through the station. "My son would never abandon his truck. That vehicle was his life. Something is wrong and you need to move now." In the corner, Haley's mother clutched her daughter's graduation photo, her voice barely above a whisper. "She calls us every night, every single night. She would never just disappear." The officer in charge, Detective James Morgan, finally stood up, coffee mug in hand, and offered a half-hearted promise to send a patrol car. "They'll probably walk through those doors before my men even reach the highway." he said, not meeting either parent's eyes. Outside the station windows, rain continued to fall, washing away footprints, tire tracks, and precious evidence with each passing minute. When dawn broke on April 20th, Greenwood awoke to news that sent shockwaves through the small Delta town. Elijah Cooper and Haley Mitchell had vanished. The abandoned blue pickup on Highway 61, with its open door and blood-stained seat, left the community with a grim certainty. This wasn't some wild adventure. It was a tragedy. Over 200 people gathered in the municipal parking lot by 9 a.m., despite the lingering rain. Police officers, volunteer firefighters, friends and neighbors, many still wearing their church clothes, formed search parties. The parking area near Tallahatchie Bridge became command central, filled with mud-splattered vehicles and grim-faced searchers. Bloodhounds strained against their leashes, noses to the ground, baying whenever they caught a scent. Their handlers struggled to keep up as the dogs pulled toward the thick woods bordering the highway. Team leaders shouted directions, splitting the group. One team headed north along the riverbank, another south toward abandoned cotton fields, while divers prepared to search the swollen, coffee-colored waters of the Tallahatchie. However, the dogs lost the trail after following it for less than a quarter mile. The handler frowned, pulling his cap lower against the drizzle. They're picking up something strong, but it stops right here at this turnout, like they got into another vehicle. A heavy silence fell as everyone looked toward the muddy side road, tire tracks already washing away in the persistent rain. By afternoon, as the storm finally began to clear, one of the search teams made a discovery. A volunteer emerged from the cattails along the river's edge, holding up a soaked object, a leather-bound journal, its pages bloated with water. The crowd gathered around as it was carefully opened. Though much of the ink had run, some pages remained legible. Poetry, song lyrics, and sketches, unmistakably Haley's handwriting. Her mother took one look and collapsed to her knees in the mud. That's her journal. She never goes anywhere without it. She reached for the soggy book with trembling hands. She would never leave this behind willingly. Meanwhile, at the police station, a gas station attendant came forward with information. On the night of April 19th, while working the late shift at a station 2 miles from where the truck was found, he had noticed a blue pickup drive, followed closely by a black sedan with tinted windows. They were moving fast, even with the rain. The sedan was riding that pickup's bumper like it was pushing it along, he said. When pressed for details about the sedan, the man hesitated. I think I saw the license plate. First 3 numbers were 529, I'm pretty sure. I wrote it down on my break, should still have it in my locker. Detective Morgan's expression changed for the first time, a flicker of interest crossing his face. A plate number could identify the vehicle's owner within hours. The investigation suddenly had direction. But the next morning, when police called the gas station to follow up, the attendant had vanished. His locker contained nothing but spare uniform shirts and a half-empty pack of cigarettes. No note with a license plate. When they finally tracked him down 3 days later at a relative's house in Jackson, he simply shook his head. I don't remember any numbers. Maybe I was confused. The statement raised eyebrows among both families and investigators. Had he been threatened, paid off, or simply mistaken? Regardless, another promising lead had evaporated like morning mist on the Mississippi. That evening ended with exhaustion and dwindling hope. The volunteer teams trudged back to their vehicles, clothes soaked through, hearts heavy. As sunset painted the sky in violent purples and reds, the river continued its silent flow, refusing to yield its secrets. The Cooper and Mitchell families sat together on the hood of Mr. Cooper's car, staring at the water-damaged journal on a folding table between them. Their eyes were hollow, but their hands remained tightly clasped, united in grief and determination to find their children. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With the witness suddenly silent and the trail growing colder by the day, investigators turned to the simplest theory: jilted romance. The first name that surfaced was Marcus Thompson, Haley's ex-boyfriend. Marcus, 21, had dated Haley throughout high school before their breakup 6 months earlier. Friends claimed he was devastated when Haley started seeing Elijah and had confronted the new couple at a local diner just weeks before their disappearance. The argument had ended with Marcus storming out, knocking over a chair in his wake. On the morning of April 22nd, just 3 days after Elijah and Haley vanished, police cruisers pulled up outside the auto shop where Marcus worked. He was escorted out in handcuffs, confusion and fear etched across his face as co-workers and customers watched in stunned silence. In the police station parking lot, Marcus's green Chevrolet Impala was thoroughly examined. Officers found deep scratches along the driver's side and what appeared to be a small dent in the front bumper. Word spread through town like wildfire. "They've got him," people whispered on street corners and in grocery store aisles. Local papers ran front-page photos of Marcus being led into the station with bold headlines, "Ex-boyfriend prime suspect in couple's disappearance." But that fragile hope for resolution quickly crumbled. Forensic tests compared paint from Marcus's car to traces found on Elijah's pickup, and the colors didn't match. DNA from the blood on the passenger seat of the abandoned truck didn't match Marcus either. Despite intense questioning over 48 hours, Marcus maintained his innocence, insisting he was at his cousin's wedding in Biloxi the entire weekend, with dozens of witnesses and photographs to prove it. When asked about Haley, his voice cracked with genuine emotion. "I loved her once. I was hurt when she left, sure, but I'd never harm a hair on her head." After 2 days in custody, Marcus was released without charges. The local paper's headlines shifted dramatically. "Suspect cleared in missing persons case," alongside images of an exhausted Marcus leaving the station, eyes downcast. As public opinion fractured, the families of the missing couple were drowning in a storm of emotions. Sarah Mitchell, Haley's younger sister, railed against the police department during a community meeting. "You wasted precious time focusing on the wrong person while my sister is still out there somewhere." Haley's mother broke down during a local news interview, her words barely audible through sobs. "Every minute that passes is another minute my daughter is missing. And they're chasing ghosts instead of finding real answers." Elijah's father paced the sheriff's office like a caged animal, his military discipline cracking under the weight of fear and frustration. "You're looking at convenient suspects instead of following evidence," he growled at Detective Morgan. "What about the black sedan the gas station attendant mentioned? Why did he suddenly change his story?" The frustration spread throughout Greenwood. Residents gathered at diners and on church steps, their voices low but urgent. Some whispered that police were deliberately ignoring crucial evidence to protect someone influential. Others wondered if the truth was so simple that everyone was overlooking it. In those tense April days, trust in local authorities evaporated like morning dew. The questions multiplied. Why was Marcus targeted so quickly when his alibi was so easily verified? Why did the witness at the gas station retract his statement about the black sedan? And perhaps most disturbing, why had search efforts been scaled back after just 1 week? Fear settled over Greenwood like a heavy blanket. Parents began driving their college-age children to campus rather than letting them take the bus. Young couples avoided lonely stretches of highway. Weekend music festivals, once the lifeblood of Delta culture, saw attendance plummet. For the Cooper and Mitchell families, the silence from official channels only deepened their resolve. They began organizing their own search parties, printing flyers and establishing a reward fund for information. Every weekend, volunteers combed different sections of woods and fields surrounding Highway 61. But as April turned to May and spring blossomed into early summer, the searches yielded nothing new. The abandoned pickup truck, Haley's water-damaged journal, and Elijah's final text message remained the only tangible pieces of a puzzle with too many missing parts. Marcus Thompson's release left the case without direction, and the mysterious black sedan, from the witness's account, vanished from official records as quickly as it had appeared. Those questions lingered, unanswered, leaving the families torn between anger and desperation. Then public attention began to fade, not from reassurance but from exhaustion. The police lost momentum, the searches grew smaller, and the scattered clues couldn't form a coherent picture of what happened that rainy April night on Highway 61. From 1999 to 2007, the case file of Elijah Cooper and Haley Mitchell's disappearance gathered dust in the records room of the Greenwood Police Department. It was only opened when someone reported seeing a girl resembling Haley at a music festival in Memphis, or a young man looking like Elijah at a gas station in Clarksdale. Each sighting was investigated, each one proved false, and each fleeting hope was extinguished, leaving behind a deeper weariness in those still waiting. By 2000, many in Greenwood had accepted that the young couple would never be found. But for their families, and for one detective who couldn't let go, the question remained as open as the driver's side door of that abandoned pickup on Highway 61. What happened to Elijah Cooper and Haley Mitchell on that rainy April night in 1998? And who was driving the black sedan that seemed to vanish from both the highway and the investigation without a trace? In 2001, on a sweltering August afternoon, Detective James Morgan sat alone in his cramped office at the Greenwood Police Department. Though officially assigned to new cases, his desk drawer contained a worn manila folder labeled Cooper, Mitchell. Morgan, now approaching retirement, had never fully let go of the case that haunted his career. The disappearance that happened on his watch. The folder contained every scrap of information collected over 3 years. Interview transcripts, search coordinates, forensic reports, and photographs of the abandoned pickup. Most telling was a small notebook where Morgan had jotted theories and questions. Many crossed out, others circled repeatedly in frustrated pen strokes. His captain had long ago ordered him to focus on active cases, but Morgan couldn't shake the memory of Haley's mother clutching that graduation photo, or Elijah's father's accusatory stare. The case had transformed from professional failure to personal obsession. That afternoon, Morgan received a call that would reignite the investigation. A highway maintenance crew clearing brush along a rarely used service road 10 miles south of where Elijah's truck was found had discovered something unusual, a cassette tape recorder, half buried in years of accumulated soil and leaves. The weathered device, its plastic casing cracked but intact, bore initials scratched into the battery compartment, E.C. Elijah Cooper's recorder, the one he'd used to capture music at the festival on that final night. Morgan drove to the site immediately, the August heat pressing against his car windows. Standing in the overgrown roadside, watching as forensic technicians photographed the spot where the recorder was found, he felt a strange mixture of dread and vindication. For years, he'd insisted the case wasn't cold, just dormant. Now tangible evidence had emerged from the earth itself. The recorder was carefully bagged and sent to the state crime lab. Technicians managed to extract the damaged tape inside and, through painstaking restoration, recover fragments of audio. Most were indecipherable, distorted by water damage and time. But one clear segment changed everything. Amid bursts of static and the distant sound of festival music came Elijah's voice, whispering urgently, "He's following us again. Black car. I'm going to try to lose," before cutting to static. When the Cooper and Mitchell families heard the recording, their reactions were visceral. Elijah's mother collapsed, hearing her son's voice after 3 years of silence. Haley's father punched a wall, his knuckles bleeding as he demanded to know why police hadn't found this earlier. Sarah Mitchell, Haley's sister, now a college student herself, stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the recorder. He said again, "That means they were being followed before that night, and they knew who it was." Her voice carried a sharpness that cut through the room's emotional chaos. Morgan reviewed his notes with renewed focus. The black sedan, mentioned in Elijah's final text and by the gas station attendant, who later recanted, was real. The voice on the tape confirmed it. But who was driving? And why had they followed the young couple? The discovery of the recorder made headlines across Mississippi. New evidence in 2001, Cooper Mitchell disappearance reopened, ran across front pages. Local television stations interviewed former classmates and co-workers. Some spoke of threats Elijah had mentioned in the weeks before disappearing, vague comments about someone watching that friends had dismissed as paranoia. One former colleague at the music store, where Elijah had worked part-time, recalled a disturbing incident. About 2 weeks before the festival, Elijah came in really shaken up. Said someone had followed him home from work 3 nights in a row. Same car, black sedan. He'd started varying his route, but they always found him. Morgan immediately tracked down the co-worker for a formal statement. "Why didn't you come forward with this in '98? He demanded. The man looked down, ashamed. "I did. I told one of your officers. He took notes and said he'd look into it. Never heard anything after that." Morgan's blood ran cold. He pulled the original case file, searching through interview records. There was no mention of this statement anywhere. Pages of reports had been filed about Marcus Thompson, the ex-boyfriend cleared within days, but crucial testimony about a stalker had somehow vanished from official records. His suspicion that the investigation had been deliberately mishandled crystallized into certainty. Morgan requested permission to officially reopen the case and was grudgingly granted a limited budget and time frame. 1 month, his captain warned. Then it goes. Back on the shelf. Sarah Mitchell, now 20, threw herself into the renewed investigation. She had graduated high school in Haley's shadow, the little sister of the girl who vanished, and had spent 3 years watching her parents slowly break under the weight of uncertainty. While her friends left for college with dreams and ambitions, Sarah carried a different mission, finding the truth about her sister. She created a website dedicated to the case, digitizing old newspaper articles and organizing timeline events. Her dorm room walls were covered with maps, photos, and index cards, connecting various pieces of information. Classmates thought she was obsessed. Sarah knew she was the only one keeping her sister's memory alive. When Morgan contacted her about the recorder, Sarah immediately sent him every theory she'd developed. Most were standard amateur detective work, but one detail caught his attention. Sarah had tracked down former gas station employees from businesses along Highway 61 and discovered that 3 other workers had reported seeing a black sedan in the area that night. None had been formally interviewed by police. Morgan expanded his investigation, re-interviewing dozens of potential witnesses, many now scattered across several states. A pattern emerged. Accounts of the black sedan had been systematically overlooked or actively discouraged. Witnesses who mentioned it described being told to stick to what they actually saw, not what they thought they saw. By early September 2001, national events overshadowed the investigation as the country reeled from the attacks of 9/11. Morgan's already limited resources were further redirected toward security concerns. But he and Sarah continued their work, meeting weekly at a diner halfway between the police station and her college campus. Then in October, another breakthrough. A retired officer who had worked the original case contacted Morgan privately. The man, now living in Florida, seemed nervous, insisting they meet somewhere public but quiet. They chose a fishing pier on the Tallahatchie River. The former officer, Robert Hayes, chain-smoked as he spoke, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. There was pressure from above to bury certain details, Hayes finally admitted, voice barely above the river's gentle sounds. The black sedan? We had the plate numbers the whole time. Gas station camera caught it clear as day, following the blue pickup. But when I submitted the report, it came back rejected. Chief told me to focus on the ex-boyfriend angle instead. Why? Morgan asked, struggling to control his anger. Who was protecting the driver? Hayes took a long drag of his cigarette. The sedan was registered to Tyler Williams, son of George Williams. The name landed like a physical blow. George Williams, former state senator, owner of half the commercial real estate in Greenwood, and major donor to the police department's annual fundraiser. Tyler was 25 in '98, Hayes continued. Had a history of complaints from young women at the community college. Stalking, unwanted attention, showing up at their workplaces. His daddy made it all go away every time. Morgan struggled to maintain his professional composure. Was there a connection between Tyler and either victim? Hayes nodded slowly. Tyler worked at the record store downtown. Same place Haley bought her music. According to an employee we interview that also vanished, Tyler had become obsessed with her, talking about how she'd come around to him eventually, when she started dating the Cooper boy instead. Jesus, Morgan whispered. And you sat on this for 3 years. Hayes looked away, shame evident in his slumped shoulders. I had kids in college, a mortgage. They made it clear what would happen if I didn't play along. But I'm retired now, and I can't take it to my grave. Morgan immediately began building a case around Tyler Williams, but found himself hitting institutional roadblocks at every turn. Evidence requisitions were delayed. Witness interview requests were denied. His captain suggested he take some vacation time to clear his head. Instead, Morgan did something unprecedented. He took his badge off, walked into the local newspaper office, and told reporter Lisa Jackson everything. The story broke the next day. Detective claims cover-up in Cooper Mitchell investigation. The article detailed Hayes' allegations, the missing reports about the black sedan, and the connection to Tyler Williams. It stopped short of directly accusing the police department of corruption, but the implication was clear. The community erupted. Protests formed outside the police station and City Hall. The Cooper and Mitchell families gave emotional interviews demanding justice. Sarah's website crashed from traffic as national media picked up the story. Under intense public pressure, the State Bureau of Investigation stepped in, taking over the case from local authorities. Morgan was placed on administrative leave, punishment for going public, but he considered it a victory. The truth was finally emerging. Tyler Williams, now 28, and working at his father's real estate company, was brought in for questioning. He denied any involvement, claiming he was at a family lake house the weekend of the disappearance. His father stood beside him at a press conference, denouncing the allegations as political persecution and threatening lawsuits against both Morgan and the newspaper. But the state investigation had resources and independence that the local department lacked. They obtained cell tower records from 1998 that placed Tyler's phone near Highway 61 the night of the disappearance. They tracked down the original gas station security footage, supposedly lost but actually stored in an evidence locker under a mislabeled tag. The grainy video showed a black sedan following a blue pickup through rain-slicked streets, just as the attendant had initially reported. Most damning was the discovery of a storage unit rented under Tyler's name since May 1998, just weeks after the disappearance. When investigators opened it, they found a collection of photographs, dozens of candid shots of Haley at the campus, at work, shopping downtown. Stalker's trophies, hidden for 3 years. On December 15, 2001, Tyler Williams was arrested and charged with kidnapping. Without bodies, prosecutors were hesitant to file murder charges, but they expressed confidence the kidnapping case was solid. George Williams immediately hired a team of expensive defense attorneys who began filing motions to suppress evidence and dismiss charges. The arrest brought a measure of validation to the Cooper and Mitchell families, but not closure. The question still remained. What had happened to Elijah and Haley? Were they still alive somewhere against all odds? Or were their remains hidden, waiting to be discovered like the recorder and journal had been? Sarah Mitchell refused to believe her sister was dead without proof. She organized volunteer searches every weekend, focusing on properties owned by the Williams family, vast tracts of farmland and forest throughout the Delta region. For months, these searches yielded nothing. The case stalled as legal maneuvering delayed Tyler's trial. Public attention began to wane once again, the initial outrage cooling into resignation. Then in March 2002, almost 4 years after the disappearance, a team of hunters tracking deer through woods near an abandoned Williams property came across something unusual, a weathered backpack partially buried under forest debris. Inside was a broken camera, the kind Haley always carried, and a leather wallet containing Elijah's expired driver's license. The discovery reignited the investigation. State forensic teams descended on the area, conducting a methodical grid search. Ground-penetrating radar identified several disturbed soil areas. Cadaver dogs marked locations of interest. Excavation began under the watchful eyes of the families who stood vigil at the forest's edge for days. On the third day of digging, investigators made the grim discovery everyone had both feared and expected: human remains. Two sets buried in a shallow grave beneath a large oak tree. Dental records would later confirm they belonged to Elijah Cooper and Haley Mitchell. The medical examiner's report painted a horrific picture. Both victims had suffered severe head trauma consistent with beating. Defensive wounds on their arms indicated they had fought for their lives. The estimated time of death aligned with the night of their disappearance, April 19, 1998. The news devastated the community. Hundreds gathered for a candlelight vigil on the town square, the flames reflecting in tear-filled eyes. The Cooper and Mitchell families, finally able to bury their children, held a joint funeral. The two coffins sat side by side, covered in flowers and photographs, while a guitar and camera, symbols of the lives cut short, rested between them. The discovery of the remains transformed the case against Tyler Williams. Prosecutors amended charges to include 2 counts of first-degree murder. The physical evidence was damning. Fibers from the trunk of his sedan matched those found on the victim's clothing. Soil from his tires matched the burial site. And most convincingly, a ring belonging to Tyler had been found in the grave soil, likely lost during the burial. Yet the Williams family's influence remained powerful. Their legal team filed motion after motion, delayed proceedings, and attempted to have evidence thrown out on technical grounds. They hired experts to challenge forensic findings and investigators to dig into the victims' pasts, looking for anything to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. Throughout 2002 and into 2003, the legal battle dragged on. Morgan, though still on administrative leave, attended every hearing, sitting beside the Cooper and Mitchell families. Sarah, now balancing college with her advocacy work, became the public face of the fight for justice, appearing on national news programs to keep attention focused on the case. The former gas station attendant who had retracted his statement came forward again, this time admitting he had been threatened by men claiming to work for George Williams. Other witnesses, previously too frightened to speak, also emerged from the shadows with similar stories, a pattern of intimidation that had helped bury the truth for years. In January 2003, almost 5 years after that rainy night on Highway 61, Tyler Williams' trial finally began. The courthouse overflowed with spectators and media. Security was tight, with rumors of threats against witnesses and jurors. The prosecution presented a meticulous case: the stalking, the pursuit on Highway 61, the attack, and the calculated cover-up afterward. They showed the jury Elijah's final text message, played the recovered audio from his recorder, and displayed the disturbing collection of photos found in the storage unit. Tyler's defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that witnesses were unreliable, that the police investigation had been flawed from the beginning. They suggested alternative theories: drug deals gone wrong, robbery by unknown assailants, even the possibility that Elijah and Haley had planned to disappear together. But as witness after witness took the stand, a clear picture emerged. Tyler Williams had become obsessed with Haley, following her for weeks. When she rejected his advances and chose Elijah instead, his obsession turned deadly. On the night of April 19, 1998, he had followed them from the festival, forced them off the road, and attacked them in a jealous rage. Then, with his family's influence, he had nearly escaped justice. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Sarah Mitchell, now a poised young woman of 22. She spoke directly to the jury about her sister, not just as a victim, but as a person with dreams and plans. She described Haley's passion for photography, her laughter, the way she'd stay up late helping Sarah with homework. She talked about the 4 years of searching, the false leads, the moments of hope crushed by disappointment. "My sister and Elijah deserved justice 4 years ago," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her tears. "They deserve it now. No one should be able to hide the truth because of their name or their money or their connections." The trial lasted 3 weeks. When the jury began deliberations, Greenwood held its breath. The Cooper and Mitchell families gathered in a small room at the courthouse, waiting. Morgan and Sarah sat with them, all connected by years of shared pursuit for the truth. After just 7 hours, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as Tyler Williams stood to hear the verdict, his expression impassive, his father seated stoically behind him. On the charge of first-degree murder of Elijah Cooper, we find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp filled the room. Sarah gripped Mrs. Mitchell's hand. On the charge of first-degree murder of Haley Mitchell, we find the defendant guilty. Elijah's mother sobbed openly. His father, who had demanded answers for 5 years, simply closed his eyes, his face a mask of pain and relief. Tyler Williams showed no emotion as he was led away in handcuffs. His father refused to speak to reporters, exiting through a side door with his team of lawyers. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, the judge showed no mercy, citing the heinous nature of the crimes and the years of deliberate obstruction. No family should have to wait 5 years for justice, he declared, before sentencing Tyler Williams to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, snow fell gently on the gathered crowd. The Cooper and Mitchell families stood together on the steps, arms around each other, faces upturned to the winter sky. For the first time in 5 years, they could begin to heal. Morgan, his badge returned following an internal investigation that vindicated his actions, stood to one side, watching. Sarah joined him, her expression thoughtful. "Is it really over?" she asked quietly. Morgan considered the question. "The case is closed. Justice is served as much as it can be." He paused, looking toward the families. "But for them, for you, I don't know if it's ever truly over." Sarah nodded slowly. Haley would have been 24 now, graduating college, maybe starting her career as a photographer. "She'd have been proud of you," Morgan said. "What you did, keeping the case alive, pushing for the truth, that made all the difference." As they stood in the falling snow, a local news crew approached, asking for a statement about the case's resolution. Sarah stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Today isn't just about punishment for a terrible crime. It's about the power of persistence. It's about a community that refused to forget. Most of all, it's about my sister and Elijah, who deserved to live full lives, but instead became a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied." The reporter asked what she would do now that the 5-year fight was over. Sarah glanced at Morgan, then back at the camera. "The same thing I've been doing, helping other families searching for answers. Because no one should have to wait 5 years for the truth. No one should have to fight a system designed to protect the powerful instead of the vulnerable." As she spoke, Morgan noticed something change in her expression, the weight of uncertainty lifting, replaced by purpose. Sarah Mitchell had entered this tragedy as a teenager, living in her sister's shadow. She emerged as an advocate, determined to light the way for others lost in similar darkness. The snow continued to fall on Greenwood, covering the old courthouse steps in a clean white blanket. For 5 years, secrets had remained buried in the Mississippi soil. Now, with truth finally unearthed, a community could begin to heal from wounds that had festered far too long. And for Sarah, standing tall where her sister should have been, the end of one mission marked the beginning of another, ensuring that what happened to Haley and Elijah and the long fight for justice that followed would help other families trapped in the limbo of unsolved cases and unanswered questions. In the decade following Tyler Williams's conviction, the Cooper and Mitchell case gradually receded from national headlines. But in Greenwood, its legacy endured, not just as a tragedy, but as a catalyst for change. The revelation of police corruption and the Williams family's influence had shaken public trust to its core. Citizens demanded reforms, transparency, and accountability from local institutions. By 2013, 15 years after that fateful night on Highway 61, the Greenwood Police Department had undergone a complete transformation. A new chief, mandatory body cameras, civilian oversight committees, and strict evidence handling protocols were implemented. The Williams family's grip on local politics had loosened, their name now synonymous with corruption rather than power. At the center of these changes stood Sarah Mitchell, now 33, whose personal tragedy had forged her into an advocate for justice. After completing law school, she had returned to Greenwood to establish the Haley Mitchell Foundation, dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and advocating for accountable policing. On a warm spring morning in 2013, Sarah stood before a crowd gathered at the unveiling of a memorial bench near Tallahatchie Bridge. The polished stone seat bore an engraved photograph of Haley and Elijah, along with the words, "Their story awakened a community. May the truth always emerge from shadows." As Sarah addressed the gathered crowd, her voice carried across the river breeze. 15 years ago, my sister and Elijah were silenced. For 5 years, powerful forces tried to ensure they remained silent forever. But today, their legacy speaks louder than ever. Among the attendees was James Morgan, now fully retired but still commanding respect in his pressed shirt and polished shoes. Beside him stood Robert Hayes, the former officer who had finally broken the code of silence. The two men, once on opposite sides of the investigation, now shared a cautious friendship forged in their eventual pursuit of truth. After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared memories, a young patrol officer approached Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, there's someone here who wants to meet you." She gestured toward a middle-aged couple standing nervously at the edge of the gathering, clutching a folder. The woman stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. "My name is Patricia Carter. My daughter Bethany disappeared 3 years ago from Clarksdale. The police investigation went nowhere, and the case was closed after 6 months." She opened the folder, revealing newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. "But I kept searching, just like you did for your sister. And I think I found something." Sarah led the couple to a quiet table overlooking the river. As they spread their documents, a familiar pattern emerged. Inconsistent police reports, witnesses whose statements changed suddenly, evidence that vanished from official records. Most troubling was a connection to a prominent local business owner, whose son had dated Bethany briefly before her disappearance. "The similarities to your sister's case. I couldn't ignore them," Patricia explained. "But no one will listen to me. They say I'm obsessed, that I need to accept she's gone." Sarah met the woman's desperate gaze with steady resolve. "I know exactly what that feels like. And I promise you, someone is listening now." That meeting, reviewing dozens of cold cases across Mississippi, disappearances, unsolved murders, and suspicious deaths that had been hastily classified as accidents. Working with a network of volunteer investigators, including Morgan and several journalists, they meticulously compared notes and looked for patterns of institutional failure or deliberate obstruction. By early 2014, their efforts yielded disturbing results. They identified at least 7 cases across 3 counties that bore striking similarities: young victims, insufficient investigations, connections to prominent families, and evidence mishandling. The Foundation compiled their findings into a comprehensive report titled "Patterns of Privilege: Justice Denied in Mississippi Cold Cases." When released to the media, the report caused an immediate sensation. State lawmakers called for hearings. The FBI launched a civil rights investigation into potential systematic corruption. Families featured in the report appeared on national news programs, sharing stories of loved ones whose cases had been buried by indifference or influence. Not everyone welcomed this spotlight. Sarah began receiving anonymous threats. Late one night, someone threw a brick through the Foundation's storefront window with a note attached: "Let sleeping dogs lie." The local newspaper that published Excerpts from the report found their office broken into, computers stolen. At a tense town hall meeting, several long-time Greenwood residents accused Sarah of digging up the past and hurting the town's reputation for personal gain. One elderly businessman stood up, pointing a finger at her. "You got justice for your sister. Why can't you just be satisfied and leave the rest of us in peace?" Sarah faced him calmly from the podium. "Justice isn't a personal commodity. It's not something I got for Haley and can now hoard away. Justice denied anywhere diminishes justice everywhere." Her words echoed through the silent room. And peace built on buried truths isn't really peace at all. It's just a quieter form of injustice. Despite resistance, momentum built behind the Foundation's work. The Bethany Carter case was formally reopened in June 2014. By September, investigators had uncovered new evidence leading to the arrest of the business owner's son, just as Patricia had suspected all along. Two other cases highlighted in the report also saw breakthroughs within months. Evidence previously claimed lost was mysteriously rediscovered once federal attention focused on departmental practices. Witnesses who had recanted years earlier came forward again, this time explaining the threats that had silenced them. Sarah's work expanded beyond Mississippi as families from neighboring states reached out. The Foundation established a network of pro bono attorneys, forensic experts, and investigative journalists willing to review long-dormant cases. They created a comprehensive database tracking patterns of evidence mishandling across jurisdictions. Morgan, despite advancing age and health issues, remained deeply involved. His decades of police experience proved invaluable in navigating departmental procedures and identifying where investigations had been deliberately derailed. "I spent too many years being part of the problem," he often said. "Whatever time I have left, I want to be part of the solution." In November 2015, the Foundation's work received unexpected validation. Following the reopening of several cases, the U.S. Department of Justice launched a formal pattern or practice investigation into multiple police departments across the Mississippi Delta region. Their preliminary findings confirmed what Sarah and her team had documented: a systemic failure to properly investigate crimes involving victims from less privileged backgrounds, especially when suspects had connections to wealth or power. On the 18th anniversary of Haley and Elijah's disappearance, Sarah stood at her sister's grave. The small cemetery was peaceful, birds singing in nearby trees as she arranged fresh flowers against the shared headstone. Elijah and Haley had been buried side by side, their families honoring the bond that had connected them in life. "You should see what's happening, Haley," Sarah said softly. "Everything changed because of you, because we wouldn't let them forget you." Her quiet moment was interrupted by her phone. The caller was Patricia Carter, her voice brimming with emotion. "They found her, Sarah. They found Bethany." After 3 years missing and presumed dead, Bethany Carter had been discovered alive, held captive in an isolated cabin owned by her ex-boyfriend's family. The rescue had come directly from evidence uncovered by the Foundation's investigation. Sarah sank to her knees beside the grave, overwhelmed. Unlike Haley, Bethany would go home to her family. She would heal, continue her life, perhaps even someday tell her own story. It wasn't the same justice Sarah had found for her sister, but in some ways it was better. A life rescued rather than just a death explained. In the months that followed, Sarah's Foundation faced its greatest challenge yet. George Williams, Tyler's father and former state senator, had maintained his public persona despite his son's conviction. Though his political career ended, his business interests thrived, and he continued to wield considerable influence in state affairs. In early 2017, the Foundation obtained documents suggesting George had not merely protected his son after the murders, but had actively participated in orchestrating the cover-up. Email records from a former police administrator indicated George had personally called the police chief the morning after the disappearance, before the abandoned truck was even officially reported. The implications were staggering. If proven, George Williams could face charges of obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and accessory after the fact, even 19 years later. Sarah took the evidence to the district attorney, who seemed reluctant to pursue such a high-profile case against a still powerful figure. The statute of limitations has expired on most of these potential charges, he explained, not meeting her eyes. And the evidence is old, communications that could be interpreted different ways. Frustrated but undeterred, Sarah called an emergency meeting of the Foundation's board. "If the system won't act on this evidence, we'll take it directly to the public," she declared. "George Williams doesn't get to wash his hands of what happened to my sister and Elijah." The Foundation published their findings online and sent packets to major news outlets. Within days, George Williams called a press conference, flanked by an imposing team of attorneys. "These accusations are nothing but a vindictive attack by a woman who cannot move past tragedy," he said, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression a mask of injured dignity. "While I continue to mourn the loss of those young people and acknowledge my son's terrible actions, I categorically deny any involvement in obstructing justice." He announced a defamation lawsuit against Sarah and the Foundation, seeking millions in damages. "This ends today," he declared to the cameras. "It's time for Greenwood to heal without Ms. Mitchell's constant reopening of old wounds." The lawsuit threatened everything Sarah had built. Legal expenses alone could bankrupt the Foundation, not to mention potential damages if Williams prevailed. Some board members urged settlement talks, fearing the organization's work with other families would be jeopardized. Sarah refused. "Settling would mean admitting we spoke falsely, when we know we spoke truth. It would undermine every other case we've advocated for." As the legal battle intensified, unexpected support emerged. Robert Hayes, the former officer who had finally revealed Tyler's connection to the case, came forward with additional information. He had kept a personal journal during the original investigation, pages of contemporaneous notes documenting conversations with George Williams, instructions to manipulate evidence, and meetings where cover-up strategies were discussed. "I was too afraid to share this in 2001, Hayes explained, pushing the worn notebook across the table to Sarah. "Even when I came forward about Tyler, I held back about his father's direct involvement. I was still protecting myself. But I can't live with that anymore." The journal provided the contemporaneous documentation the case needed. Hayes agreed to testify, despite threats to his family and personal safety. 3 other former officers, seeing Hayes step forward, found their courage and came forward as well. Faced with mounting evidence and witnesses, the district attorney finally agreed to pursue charges against George Williams for his role in obstructing the investigation. On a rainy morning in April 2017, almost exactly 19 years after Haley and Elijah disappeared, George Williams was arrested at his office. The trial became a media sensation, reopening wounds many in Greenwood had hoped were healing. Unlike his son's proceedings, George maintained a dignified, even sympathetic public persona throughout. The respected businessman, the father who couldn't believe his son capable of murder, the pillar of the community who might have made mistakes but surely didn't deserve to be vilified. Sarah attended every day of testimony, sitting beside the Coopers, just as she had during Tyler's trial. The evidence was less visceral than the physical proof of murder had been, but no less damning. Phone records showing George called police officials before the investigation formally began, bank transfers to key witnesses who later changed their stories, and Hayes's detailed journal became a turning point. Over the following months, Sarah and her foundation began documenting the systematic dismantling of the case from within. Most powerful was Hayes's testimony about a meeting at William's home just days after the disappearance. He sat there sipping brandy, telling us exactly which evidence needed to disappear, Hayes recounted, his voice steady despite William's cold stare from the defense table. He said his family had built this town, and they wouldn't be destroyed by some musician and his girlfriend. Those were his exact words. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. Sarah held her breath as the verdict was read, guilty of obstruction of justice, guilty of tampering with evidence, guilty of accessory after the fact. George Williams showed the first crack in his composed demeanor, shoulders slumping slightly as the final verdict was announced. At sentencing the following month, the judge addressed him directly. "Mr. Williams, your actions represent the most dangerous form of corruption, the belief that wealth and influence place certain citizens above the law. While your son committed the physical act of murder, your systematic effort to prevent justice makes you morally complicit in their deaths. You betrayed not just 2 young victims, but the entire community that trusted you as a leader." George Williams was sentenced to 20 years in prison. At 78, it effectively meant he would likely die behind bars, much like his son would. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Sarah for comment. Cameras flashed as she stood on the same steps where, 14 years earlier, she had spoken after Tyler's conviction. "Today closes a chapter that should have ended 19 years ago," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. But the larger story continues. Across this state, across this country, there are families still waiting for answers, still fighting systems designed to protect the powerful rather than serve the vulnerable. She gestured toward Patricia Carter and several other families standing behind her, people whose cases the foundation had helped reopen, whose loved ones had finally received justice after years of official indifference. "What happened to my sister and Elijah was not unique. The only unique part was that we refused to be silenced. Every cold case deserves that same persistence. Every family deserves answers, and no one, no matter their name or their wealth, should be able to place themselves beyond justice." In the years that followed, Sarah's foundation expanded its mission. They developed training programs for police departments on cold case investigation and evidence preservation. They worked with law schools to establish innocence projects across the South. They advocated for legislation requiring external review when investigations involving influential suspects were closed without resolution. On the 20th anniversary of the disappearance in 2018, Sarah published a book titled "Emerging from Shadows: A Sister's Search for Justice." It chronicled not just Haley and Elijah's case, but the larger journey that had transformed both Sarah and her community. The book became a national bestseller, bringing attention to dozens of similar cases across the country. That same year, the foundation established the Haley Mitchell Scholarship for Investigative Journalism, supporting students committed to covering criminal justice issues. The first recipient was a young reporter who had grown up hearing about the case, inspired by Sarah's refusal to let truth remain buried. James Morgan, now in his 70s and increasingly frail, attended the scholarship ceremony. As Sarah helped him to the podium, he squeezed her hand. "Your sister would be so proud," he whispered, "not just of finding her justice, but of everything that came after." Morgan passed away peacefully in his sleep just 3 months later. At his funeral, hundreds gathered to honor the detective whose career had been defined by one case he refused to abandon. Sarah delivered the eulogy, speaking of a man who had the courage to admit when the system failed and the determination to make it right. "Detective Morgan taught me that true integrity isn't about never making mistakes," she told the mourners. "It's about having the courage to correct them, no matter how late the hour." Following the ceremony, as attendees shared memories, a young officer approached Sarah. "Miss Mitchell, I joined the force because of your sister's case. I wanted to be the kind of officer who does it right the first time." Sarah smiled, noting the body camera on his uniform and the earnest determination in his eyes, tangible symbols of how much had changed since that rainy night in 1998 when an indifferent officer had dismissed two missing young people as runaways. By 2023, 25 years after Haley and Elijah disappeared, the Foundation had helped reopen over 60 cold cases across 5 states. 37 had been resolved, bringing closure to families who had lived for years or even decades in the limbo of unanswered questions. The remaining cases continued to receive attention, their files no longer gathering dust on forgotten shelves. The small memorial bench near Tallahatchie Bridge had expanded into a garden of remembrance, honoring not just Haley and Elijah, but all those who had disappeared from the region over the years. Some names had resolution beside them, others still awaited answers. Sarah visited often, tending to plants and speaking quietly to her sister about new developments. On the anniversary that April, Sarah stood before a gathering of families, advocates, and officers, both those who had been part of the journey from the beginning and new allies who had joined along the way. 25 years ago, 2 young people vanished from Highway 61, she began. Their disappearance could have been just another tragic headline, eventually forgotten by all but those who loved them. Instead, it became a catalyst for transformation of a police department, of a community's understanding of justice, and of my own purpose. She looked out at the faces watching her, the Mitchell and Cooper families, now with grandchildren who knew Haley and Elijah only through stories and photographs. Patricia Carter and her daughter Bethany, now an advocate herself for survivors of captivity. Young officers trained in systems created in response to past failures. Reporters whose investigations had helped shine light into long, dark corners. The shadow that fell across Highway 61 that night was not just the darkness of violence, Sarah continued. It was the shadow of privilege, of corruption, of systems designed to protect certain people at the expense of others. But shadows exist only where light is blocked. They vanish when truth shines directly. She gestured to the memorial garden surrounding them, spring flowers blooming among the stones, bearing names and dates. This place honors those who were taken from us, but it also celebrates what they gave us, the determination to create a world where no family waits 5 years for answers, where no one is considered expendable, where truth ultimately emerges no matter how deep the shadows. As twilight fell across the delta, candles were lit throughout the garden, one for each name on the memorial stones. The small flames flickered in the gentle breeze, pushing back the gathering darkness. Sarah lit 2 candles, placing them on the stone bench bearing Haley and Elijah's photograph. "The work isn't finished," she said softly, as much to herself as to those around her. "As long as there are families waiting for answers, as long as there are systems that value some lives more than others, as long as there are powerful people who believe they can bury truth, the work continues." The candles burned long into the night, their light reflecting on the dark waters of the Tallahatchie. And in that light, visitors could read the words now engraved below Haley and Elijah's image. "From the deepest shadows, truth will always find its way into light." The Mississippi 1998 cold case, once just another tragedy in a long line of unsolved mysteries, had become something much more, a testament to the power of persistence, the necessity of accountability, and the enduring human need for truth, no matter how long delayed or how deeply buried. And for Sarah Mitchell, the journey that began in grief had transformed into a mission, reaching far beyond her sister's case. She had learned perhaps the most important lesson of all, that true justice is never just about the past. It's about creating a future where such stories no longer need to be told. The 25th anniversary of Haley and Elijah's case marked a turning point for the Haley Mitchell Foundation. What had begun as one sister's determined quest for justice had grown into a nationally recognized organization with offices in 5 states. Their work had directly led to the resolution of dozens of cold cases and the reform of numerous police departments across the South. In early 2024, Sarah Mitchell found herself standing before a congressional subcommittee in Washington, D.C., testifying about the systemic failures that allowed cases like her sister's to go unsolved for years. Her testimony supported the Cold Case Accountability Act, legislation that would provide federal resources for reviewing long-dormant investigations and establish independent oversight for cases involving influential suspects. When my sister and Elijah disappeared in 1998, I was just a teenager, Sarah told the packed hearing room, her voice steady after decades of public speaking. I didn't understand then how privilege could distort justice, how power could bury truth. I only knew that the people responsible for finding my sister seemed strangely reluctant to look in certain directions. She detailed the Foundation's findings across hundreds of cases, patterns of evidence, mishandling, witness intimidation, and investigative roadblocks that disproportionately affected cases where victims were poor or marginalized, or where suspects had wealth or connections. This isn't about one corrupt police department or one influential family, she concluded. This is about a system that too often values certain lives more than others, that allows truth to remain buried when its revelation might disturb the powerful. The legislation passed with bipartisan support, a rare moment of unity in an otherwise divided political landscape. President Harris signed it into law in June 2024, with Sarah standing alongside families from across the country whose loved ones' cases had been reopened through the Foundation's efforts. As she left the White House that afternoon, Sarah received a call from her office in Greenwood. Bethany Carter, now the Foundation's deputy director, had urgent news. "The Phillips County Sheriff just called," Bethany said, her voice tight with emotion. "They found remains in an old well outside Helena. They think it's Melissa Winters." Sarah gripped the phone tighter. Melissa Winters had disappeared from a college campus in Arkansas in 1997, one of the Foundation's earliest cases outside Mississippi. For 7 years, they had painstakingly reconstructed evidence that local authorities had initially dismissed, revealing connections to a local business family with ties to law enforcement. "Are they sure?" Sarah asked, already flagging down a taxi to take her to the airport. "DNA tests are pending, but they found her class ring and the watch her parents gave her for graduation. It's her, Sarah, and they've issued a warrant for James Talbot. James Talbot, son of a former sheriff, nephew of a judge, heir to a shipping company. The man who had dated Melissa briefly before her disappearance, whose family connections had seemingly made him untouchable despite multiple witnesses placing him with Melissa the night she vanished. "I'm on my way," Sarah said. "Call the Winters family. Tell them I'll meet them there." The discovery of Melissa's remains 27 years after her disappearance made national headlines. Media outlets linked it directly to the newly signed Cold Case Accountability Act, citing it as the first success of legislation inspired by the Cooper Mitchell case. In Helena, Arkansas, Sarah stood beside Mr. and Mrs. Winters as they faced cameras outside the courthouse following James Talbot's arraignment. Their hair had turned grey, waiting for justice, their faces lined with decades of uncertainty, now replaced by grief mixed with vindication. "We never gave up hope of finding our daughter," Mrs. Winters said, her voice breaking. "And we never would have gotten this far without Sarah and the Haley Mitchell Foundation. They believed us when no one else would." Later that evening, sitting in the Winters' living room, surrounded by photos of Melissa, forever young in frozen moments, Sarah reflected on how far they had come. Patricia Carter sat beside her, now a senior investigator with the Foundation. Together, they had built something that extended far beyond Haley and Elijah's case, creating a network of support and expertise for families who might otherwise face their darkest hours alone. "Do you ever think about stopping?" Patricia asked softly, watching as the Winters showed Bethany their daughter's high school yearbooks. "You've been fighting this fight for over 25 years now." Sarah considered the question, turning her wedding ring absently. She had married 10 years earlier, a professor of criminal justice who understood her mission, and they had 2 children named Hope and Justice, a private family joke that had become prophetic as the children grew into compassionate, determined young people. "I used to think there would be an end point," Sarah admitted. "Find Haley's killer, then move on with my life. Get Tyler Williams convicted, then find peace. Expose George's role in the cover-up, then finally put it all behind me." She shook her head slowly. But each resolution just revealed how many other families were still searching, how many other truths remained buried. Patricia nodded. "We can't solve every case." "No," Sarah agreed, "but we can ensure no case is forgotten simply because it's inconvenient or because the right people want it buried. That's not stopping, that's just changing what justice looks like." Bedane. As they prepared to leave Arkansas the following day, Sarah received news that the governor of Mississippi had signed an executive order establishing a cold case review unit within the State Bureau of Investigation. The unit would be named after Haley Mitchell and Elijah Cooper. "Your sister and her boyfriend have become symbols of something much larger than themselves," the governor told Sarah in a phone call. "They've come to represent our state's commitment to justice delayed but not denied." Sarah felt a complex wave of emotions at the news. Part of her was deeply moved that Haley's name would be associated with helping others find answers. Yet another part recognized the irony that the same state institutions that had once participated in burying her sister's case were now claiming it as inspiration. "Symbols matter," she acknowledged to the governor. "But actions matter more. This unit needs proper funding, independence from political pressure, and clear protocols for handling cases involving influential suspects." The governor assured her that representatives from her foundation would sit on the unit's advisory board, helping establish those protocols and providing training for investigators. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. A systematic change that might prevent future cases from following Haley and Elijah's tragic path. In October 2024, Sarah returned to Greenwood for a special ceremony marking the opening of the Foundation's new headquarters. The building, once the town's historic post office, had been renovated to house expanded operations, including a forensic library, training facilities for law enforcement, and a support center for families of missing persons. As she cut the ribbon, Sarah reflected on how much Greenwood itself had changed. The town that had once protected Tyler Williams and nearly buried the truth about her sister now proudly claimed the Foundation as part of its identity. Streets that had once whispered with suspicion when Sarah pursued the case now displayed banners celebrating the Foundation's work. Former Detective Morgan's daughter, herself now a police captain in Jackson, spoke at the ceremony. "My father always said that the Cooper-Mitchell case both broke his heart and saved his soul," she told the crowd. "It showed him how justice could fail, but also how it could be reclaimed through persistence and courage." The Foundation's new building included a memorial wall, photographs of cases resolved through their work, arranged alongside timelines showing how long each family had waited for answers. Some spanned decades, others just a few years, but each represented lives remembered, truths unearthed, and systems held accountable. That evening, after the crowds had dispersed, Sarah walked alone to the small cemetery where Haley and Elijah rested. 26 years had passed since she had stood by their graves as a broken-hearted 20-year-old, vowing that their story would not end in that shallow grave near the Tallahatchie. She placed fresh flowers on the shared headstone, now weathered by years of sun and rain. "I kept my promise," she said quietly. "Your story didn't end there. It keeps opening new chapters." As 2024 drew to a close, the Foundation faced its greatest challenge yet. Their investigations had expanded beyond individual cases to examine patterns across jurisdictions, revealing what appeared to be a coordinated effort to suppress certain investigations throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. The evidence pointed to the involvement of not just local officials like George Williams, but state-level law enforcement administrators and even federal agents operating in the region. Cases spanning 3 states showed similar interference patterns, evidence that went missing, witnesses who recanted after receiving threats, investigations redirected toward convenient suspects rather than following actual evidence. This is bigger than corrupt local police or influential families protecting their own, Sarah told her leadership team during a strategy meeting in December. This suggests systemic corruption at multiple levels, possibly tied to organized crime or political interests. The Foundation's legal director, a former prosecutor who had joined their team after the Bethany Carter rescue, looked troubled. If we pursue this, we're challenging extremely powerful interests. It could endanger everything we've built. Sarah considered the risks. The Foundation now employed over 50 staff across 5 states. They provided critical support to hundreds of families each year. Their training programs reached thousands of officers. All of that could be jeopardized if they targeted the wrong people or institutions without ironclad evidence. Yet the patterns were undeniable. The same names appeared in case after case. Officers who transferred between departments just as questions arose. Administrators who authorized file closures against investigator recommendations. Judges who sealed records that might have revealed connections between seemingly unrelated cases. If we don't pursue this, we're perpetuating the same system that buried Haley and Elijah's case, Sarah finally said. We can't help families find justice while ignoring the biggest obstacle to that. Justice. The Foundation established a special task force operating with heightened security protocols. They partnered with investigative journalists from major publications, creating a safety net of public awareness. If anything happened to their investigation, the journalists would immediately publish what they knew. By early 2025, their work had begun yielding results. They identified a network of at least 12 former law enforcement officials who had systematically protected certain suspects and buried evidence across multiple jurisdictions. The pattern suggested coordination with several prominent political families whose members had held state offices during the period in question. As they prepared to take their findings to federal authorities, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at the Foundation headquarters, Robert Hayes, the former officer whose testimony had been crucial in both Tyler and George Williams' convictions. Now in his 70s, Hayes looked fragile but determined as he placed a small safe deposit box key on Sarah's desk. I kept one last insurance policy, he said, his voice raspy with age. Bank in Biloxi. This opens box 447. What's in it? Sarah asked, studying the old man's face. Names, dates, meeting locations. I was deeper in it than I ever admitted, even when I testified. Hayes's hands trembled slightly. I wasn't just following orders about the Cooper-Mitchell case. I was part of a structure that buried dozens of cases over 15 years. Sarah felt a chill despite the warm office. Why come forward now? I'm dying, Hayes said simply. Cancer. Few months left, maybe less. And I've watched what you've built here. How many families have found answers because of you? I don't want to take these names to my grave. The documents in the safe deposit box provided the final pieces to the puzzle the Foundation had been assembling. Hayes had meticulously documented a network of corruption that spanned multiple states, officers paid to redirect investigations, evidence deliberately mishandled, witnesses threatened or bribed. Most damning were records of regular meetings between law enforcement officials and representatives of several prominent families, including the Williams. With Hayes's testimony and documentation, the Foundation presented their findings to the Department of Justice in February 2025. Within weeks, federal agents began executing search warrants across Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Former officials were brought in for questioning. Current administrators were placed on leave, pending investigation. The scope of the corruption shocked even Sarah, who had spent nearly 3 decades immersed in its consequences. Dozens of cases beyond those the Foundation had identified showed signs of interference. Families who had never understood why their loved ones' cases went cold suddenly had answers, not about what happened to the victims, but about why justice had been denied. As federal indictments began to roll out in spring 2025, Sarah found herself once again at the center of media attention. National news programs featured the Foundation's work, highlighting how a sister's determined quest for truth had ultimately exposed corruption reaching to the highest levels of regional power structures. Did you ever imagine, when you began searching for answers about your sister, that it would lead to this? A prominent news anchor asked during a primetime interview. Sarah considered the question carefully. I never set out to expose corruption or reform systems. I just wanted to know what happened to Haley and who was responsible. She paused, glancing at the photograph of her sister that still sat on her desk after all these years. But each answer just led to more questions. And at some point, I realized that finding justice for Haley meant challenging the forces that wanted her case buried. In May 2025, Robert Hayes passed away peacefully in hospice care, having lived long enough to see the first federal convictions resulting from his testimony. At his funeral, Sarah delivered a eulogy that acknowledged both his initial participation in corruption and his ultimate courage in exposing it. Robert's life reminds us that it's never too late to choose truth, she told the gathered mourners. He could have taken these secrets to his grave, but instead he chose to become part of healing the very system he had once helped corrupt. As summer arrived, the Foundation continued its dual mission, supporting individual families, searching for answers, while advocating for systemic reforms that might prevent future cases from being buried. The federal investigation expanded, revealing connections between the law enforcement corruption and political influence peddling that had shaped regional policies for decades. On the 27th anniversary of Haley and Elijah's disappearance, Sarah spoke at a national conference on cold case investigation. Her keynote address drew on both her personal journey and the Foundation's research across hundreds of cases. When we talk about cold cases, we often focus on technological advances, new DNA techniques, digital reconstruction, advanced forensics. She told the audience of investigators, advocates, and family members. Those tools are vital, but they can't overcome human systems designed to protect certain people from accountability. She shared statistics from the Foundation's research, how cases were significantly more likely to remain unsolved when suspects had connections to wealth or power, how investigations involving victims from marginalized communities received fewer resources and less media attention, how evidence preservation protocols were more frequently violated in cases touching influential interests. The greatest obstacle to justice in many cold cases isn't technical limitations, Sarah continued. It's human choices, the decision to look away from certain suspects, to mishandle evidence that points in uncomfortable directions, to silence witnesses who threaten established power. She concluded by directly addressing the families in attendance, people whose loved ones' cases remained unsolved, some for decades. The most important thing I've learned in 27 years of this work is that truth doesn't have an expiration date. It waits in the shadows, in forgotten evidence boxes, in witnesses who were afraid to speak, in officers who carried guilt about cases they were forced to abandon. Our job is to create conditions where that truth can finally emerge. After her speech, Sarah was approached by a young woman clutching a folder of newspaper clippings about her brother, who had disappeared in Louisiana in 2010. As Sarah listened to her story, she recognized the familiar patterns: police dismissiveness, evidence that vanished, witnesses who suddenly became uncooperative. "I don't know if we'll ever find out what happened to him," the woman said, her voice breaking. "But watching what you've accomplished gives me hope that at least someone believes the truth matters." Sarah reached for the woman's hand, thinking of her own journey from the devastated teenager who had watched her parents collapse under the weight of uncertainty to the advocate who had ultimately helped reshape how an entire region approached justice. The truth does matter, she assured the woman. "And it has more allies than you know." Throughout the summer and fall of 2025, the federal investigation continued to expand, revealing a web of corruption that had influenced cases across the Deep South for decades. Former officials testified against each other, exposing a system where certain families and interests had operated with practical immunity. In September, the Cold Case Review, units established under the federal legislation inspired by Haley and Elijah's case, announced their first major breakthrough, the identification of remains found in an abandoned quarry in Tennessee, bringing closure to a family whose daughter had disappeared in 1985. The young woman had last been seen at a party attended by the son of a former congressman. Initial investigations had focused elsewhere despite witness statements, and the case had gone cold within months. 40 years later, advanced DNA techniques and a fresh review of witness statements finally revealed the truth. As more cases were resolved and more corruption exposed, Sarah found herself reflecting on the long, winding path that had led to this moment. What had begun as one family's desperate search for answers had evolved into a movement that was fundamentally changing how justice operated across multiple states. In November 2025, the foundation was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for its work exposing systematic corruption and advocating for victims' rights. Sarah accepted the honor in Washington, surrounded by her family, her team, and representatives of dozens of families who had found answers through their work. This recognition belongs to every family who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten, she said in her acceptance speech. To every witness who found the courage to speak despite threats, to every honest officer who pushed back against corruption from within, and most of all to Haley and Elijah, whose spirits have guided this work for 27 years. As the year drew to a close, Sarah returned once more to the small memorial garden near Tallahatchie Bridge, where it had all begun. The garden had expanded over the years, now containing stone markers for dozens of victims whose cases had been resolved through the foundation's efforts. She sat on the bench bearing Haley and Elijah's image, now weathered by years of Mississippi sun and rain. The young couple's faces had begun to fade slightly on the stone, just as Sarah sometimes found it harder to recall the exact sound of her sister's laugh or the precise shade of her eyes. Yet, the impact of their lives and their deaths had only grown stronger with time. Their names now adorned legislation, investigation units, scholarships, and training programs. Their story had become a catalyst for change that reached far beyond one family or one community. Sarah placed fresh flowers beneath the memorial, touching the stone gently. "I never could have imagined where this path would lead," she said softly, as if her sister could hear. "But I think you would be proud of what your memory has built." As twilight settled over the delta, Sarah remained on the bench, watching. Fireflies began to rise from the tall grass along the river. The Tallahatchie flowed silently nearby, carrying its waters toward the Mississippi just as it had on that rainy night in 1998 when 2 young lives were cut short. But what had begun in darkness had ultimately brought light to dozens of cases, to hundreds of families, to systems that had operated in shadows for generations. And though the work would never truly be complete as long as cases remained unsolved and justice remained imperfect, Sarah knew that something fundamental had shifted. The truth that had emerged from the shadows cast across Highway 61 that April night had illuminated far more than just one case. It had revealed the possibilities of justice that persists, of systems that can be reformed, and of ordinary people who refuse to let silence be the final answer when those they love disappear into darkness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.